Welcome to I'll Drink to Fact, a true story versus Hollywood podcast where we take a look at movies based on a true story and compare them to the real life stories that they are based upon. And then we do a little talking and find out whether they are actually true or full of crap. My name is Daniel.
And I'm Katie.
And we will be guiding you on this journey. Today, the journey we will be taking is on the movie Karla, which is based on the true story of
Karla Homolka.
Yes, and her boyfriend Paul Bernardo.
Hey, what's in your cup?
Oh, yes, because we always do this drinking. That's the I'll Drink to Fact part. I am drinking just a bourbon and Coke with some Bullet bourbon in it.
Nice.
What are you drinking over there, my dear?
I like how you say we always do this drinking part, and this is our first episode.
Oh, this is a very valid
everyone,
point.
Welcome to our first episode.
Hey, yeah.
I am drinking a Mud Puppy Porter from Central Waters Brewing Company of my home state of Wisconsin.
There we
go. So
go.
for our first episode, I just wanted to drink a beer from my homeland. Mud Puppy Porter. It's
Nice.
delicious.
Nice. It is. And it's actually, we bought that when we went up to Wisconsin last Christmas. So we are 8 months later here.
This is the last one, and I was saving it for a special occasion. And that special occasion is our first episode of I'll Drink to Fact.
There we go. All right. Let's get off into this. We're going to talk about the movie a little bit first, and then we'll get into the true story. And then we'll compare notes. Sound good? So the movie is Karla, spelled with a K. It was directed by Joel Bender. It's starring Laura Prepon from That 70s Show fame and Misha Collins from Supernatural. This movie, well, the story itself takes place in Canada. So the movie was released in Canada on January 20th, 2006. It wasn't released here in the States until almost a year later on January 11th, 2007. The runtime is an hour and 40 minutes. So if you have an hour and 40 minutes to spare, check it out.
And I don't know if we can say this, but if you have Amazon Prime, it's on Prime Video right now. Is that what we watched it on?
We did. We watched it on Prime Video for free.
For free, aside from your yearly subscription. So
if you are listening to this at a time, I don't know where I was going to go with that. So moving forward, the budget of this movie was $5 million. The script is claimed to be based on court transcriptions, interviews, and video shot by Paul Bernardo and Karla Homolka. So as you'll see as we go through this, they were very big on their home videos, and apparently a lot of that was used against them. So as we get into the movie, there is a intro credit screen, and there is some of that home video footage. It is all dramatized home video footage because it is of Laura Prepon and Misha Collins. It is not of the actual people in this case. As we lead out of the credits, we go into Karla Homolka is meeting with Dr. Arnold, a psychologist at Canada's Regional Psychiatric Center in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan. Hopefully I didn't butcher that too much. The date is October 15th, 2000, and his job is to evaluate Karla for parole eligibility, which sets us up to have Karla tell us her story in at least her version of her story. Karla starts the story, says that she met Paul in a hotel restaurant. Her and her friend Peggy were there for a veterinary convention. Karla was 18 at the time. There's a real quick meeting between them, and then we jump straight into some sex scenes. There's a sex scene right after they meet in the hotel in front of their friends, and then they have a sex scene where Karla is encouraging a rape fantasy. At this point, Dr. Arnold asks if she, at this time, knew about Paul's previous rape experience. They do a short cut scene of Paul raping someone in the woods. Dr. Arnold mentions that Paul was a suspect in the Scarborough rapes. She said at the time she had no clue that Paul was actually the guy, but had overheard some things.
So one thing that I wanted to ask, I don't believe you said, what is this movie rated? Or does it have a rating because it was released in Canada? So does it not have one of our American ratings?
No, I'm sure it does. I honestly did not look into that. So I would assume it's PG-13 because not a lot is shown. There is very, very brief nudity. The sexual scenes are not really that sexual.
So that was one thing I was going to say that I was really surprised with in this movie was that clearly there were sex scenes, clearly there was rape happening, but there wasn't a lot of nudity. I felt like they were very careful to cover up, which was surprising because it's like very clearly they're having intercourse.
Right. And I was going to get into it later that Paul Bernardo is definitely like the definition of a Minuteman in this movie. It is, every sex scene lasts about 30 seconds, and it is from beginning to end. Like, he's like, oh, let me get in there. I am done. Let's call this a night and kill somebody. It's horrible. So, anyway, back to the movie. At this point, we have talked about Paul and his Scarborough rape being a suspect. And now we turn to Tammy, who was Karla's little sister and the first rape/murder by this couple. Paul became infatuated with Tammy because of her innocence and virginity. Karla was not a virgin when they met, and Paul, I guess, held that against her and fell in love with her younger sister by a couple years. There's a scene where after a long day of shopping, Paul and Tammy come back. Karla confronts Paul about his infatuation to the point where Paul now admits that he just wants Tammy. Despite loving and promising to marry only Karla, he just basically wants to take Tammy's virginity. Mm-hmm. Paul convinces Karla to let him have Tammy. The movie makes it seem like he manipulates it into happening. Of course, this is all being told from Karla's point of view. And Paul convinces Karla to steal some drugs from the veterinary clinic she works to help make this happen. So one Christmas night, they decide they're going to get her drunk. They're going to drug her. They drug her with a drug named Halcyon, which is a very potent benzodiazepine used in the treatment of insomnia. I mean, we're talking like many more times potent than Xanax, and they were like loading this girl up with this stuff. Once she passes out, Paul orders Karla to put halothane over Tammy's face, which they use in the surgery of like these animals at the veterinary clinic to basically keep things passed out. So they're using it for the same sense here. They want Tammy to stay unconscious while Paul rapes away. So then Paul rapes Tammy. During the rape, Tammy starts to vomit and choke from being drugged, probably an overdose because they're obviously not doctors and don't know what the hell they're doing. She becomes unresponsive, and Karla and Paul call 911. Tammy is then taken to the hospital. There's a detective there getting the information from Paul and Karla as to what happened. He receives a phone call basically saying she's now been pronounced dead. The detective says, okay, we've got to continue this downtown now. And Karla asks Paul immediately, what did you do with the tape? Dun, dun, dun. At this point, Paul loses his job. His mother throws him out of the house, and he moves in with Karla's family, which Karla's family's never shown in this film.
No, which is interesting. I guess now that I know a little bit of the real story, Karla actually has a third sister that is never once mentioned in the movie.
No shit. Wow.
Yeah, her name is Lori.
That's crazy. Yeah, because like even the like short funeral film they had for Tammy, or funeral scene they had for Tammy, it just showed a close up of the coffin. Like it didn't show family members at all.
It's very odd.
Yeah, it's very odd director's choice there. Mm-hmm. So anyway, at this time, Paul is living with Karla's family, and he starts watching the Christmas video of Tammy a lot. And of course, he's not watching the rape part. He's watching the like her getting drunk part and making a big deal about it to, you know, how could someone that young die like this? During one of these watch parties, Paul is given a business proposition by his friend Nick to start smuggling cigarettes across the U.S.-Canada border, a position that would earn him $3,000 to $4,000 a month. Paul jumps all over it. They start using this new income to rent a house in Port de Lucie, and they get a dog. While in Port de Lucie, Karla claims that she had knowledge of Paul raping another 4 to 5 women, even to the extreme in the movie of him coming home, like, all manic and stuff and just being like, yeah, just raped a girl, no big deal. Yeah, I took this off of her. I'm gonna go burn it in the fireplace.
Yeah,
it was really,
he was, like,
really
bringing
weird.
Things home from his rapes.
Yeah,
which was
like,
and then
like,
not
hey baby, just so you know, just stuck my penis in some random woman.
Yeah, it was weird. It was almost like, and here's the proof, but I'm gonna destroy it. So it's not like he was keeping souvenirs.
Right. It was almost like just his proof to her. Like,
right. Yeah. That's gross.
So anyway, at this point, he then informs Karla, hey, I'm leaving to go to Florida for a couple weeks. I'll treat it as my bachelor party. So he disappears for 10 days. There's a little montage of Karla, just patiently waiting, watching out the window like her man went to war or something.
That is exactly what it's like.
It is, yeah. So he gets back, they immediately get in the sack, and then he says, hey, while I was gone, I fucked a girl named Tracy. I gave her the number here. If she calls, you just tell her you're my sister. And then apparently he fell asleep, and the same night that he got back from Florida is when he went out and abducted their second victim, who in the movie, her name is Tina McCarthy. Tina McCarthy is then taken back to the house. Actually, let me stop. There's a funny scene, I say funny, where he is abducting Tina, and she's trapped outside of her house, and he's like standing outside of her house. She's like, hey, what are you doing? And he was like, oh, I was just planning to break into your neighbor's house.
Yeah.
And she's like, oh, okay, cool. You got a cigarette?
Yep.
It's just like, yeah, that's
Just
the
not a big
person
deal.
that you trust. No big deal.
Right.
So anyway, Tina gets abducted, taken back to the house. Paul walks into his sleeping girlfriend, fiance, and he's like, hey, just so you know, I've abducted another woman, and I'm going to just make one of my videos. So she gets up for a minute. There's a blindfolded Tina in her room. Paul starts making her strip, and Karla's like, to hell with this, I'm going back to bed. So the next day, Karla wakes and finds the room with Tina locked. During this time, there's a montage, another montage, the second, of Karla reading in multiple rooms, 3 different books, 3 different rooms in what we're supposed to believe is a day. So either Karla's a stupid fast reader, or she loses interest in books quick.
Read.
Yeah. But she's growing more impatient of Paul's return to her. And in one scene, I found it interesting. You can make out that she's reading American Psycho by Bret Easton Ellis as Paul walks into the room to take a break in his rape-a-thon.
How appropriate.
I thought it was very appropriate. At this point, Karla, eager for attention, decides to join in. At the beginning of this, what's going to start being a threesome, Karla takes off the blindfold to kiss Tina. They're both instructing her to keep her eyes shut. Right. And of course, she, like the rebellious child that she is, opens her eyes, and Paul gets infuriated. He then decides, we've got to kill her. She can identify us now. Even though her eyes were wide open when he abducted her.
That's true. Also, if you don't want her to identify, you don't take her blindfold off in the first place.
Right. I thought it was very odd. It's like, oh yeah, I've got to take this blindfold off to kiss you.
Maybe it was like a compulsory thing, like wanting to trap her so that they would have to kill her.
Right.
I don't know.
So anyway, then Paul decides to kill her, and he strangles her in front of Karla. The next day, they decide what to do with Tina's body, because obviously they were too tired the night before to make any real decisions other than killing her. And Paul decides that he's going to dismember Tina's body and put the pieces into cement blocks. And then they dump the blocks of cement under the cover of night into a lake. After Tina's murder, it doesn't really give us a timeline, but they decide to get married. They go to Hawaii for their honeymoon. After they arrive back from their honeymoon in Hawaii, they learn that Tina's body has been discovered and identified. So after this, Paul took it easy for a while because obviously the cops were hot on this. So he started sleeping with other women, but it's shown to be more of a consensual way. Like there's a party at the house and he gets this woman drunk and has sex with her in the bathroom while Karla's outside. He also starts to alienate himself from his friends and grow more aggressive, I guess because he can't take it out on little girls. So Easter that year, they abduct their third victim, whose name in the movie is given Caitlin Ross. Caitlin is raped and tormented. She is forced to call Paul her master and demean herself. Things like calling her a slut and things like that. Caitlin's shoe is found at the site of the abduction, leading to a police investigation. There's a televised press conference with Caitlin's parents in which they beg for her release. Paul, upon coming across this press conference, forces Caitlin to watch it. He then starts listening to his own music while shadowboxing / dancing on the bed in this really weird scene that's very reminiscent of like Mac on It's Always Sunny. It was really, really, really weird. I didn't understand. Karla decides to go take a shower and showers the most angrily I've ever seen anybody shower.
Can I just, I'm not going to bring this up in my true story, but Paul was an aspiring rapper.
I mentioned the rapping here in a few minutes too.
Okay,
There's
I'm
a rap
sorry.
scene.
Not to spoil it.
Oh yeah, no, he went totally Marky Mark for a while. It was lovely. So like I said, Karla showers very, very angrily. I mean, like, it was interesting. Actually, Karla's shower scene seemed much more like a rape scene than any of the rape scenes. Now that I think about it.
When I was watching it, I took her as she was feeling dirty and she was just trying to come clean, like get the nastiness off of her, like
fair enough,
very angrily, just trying to like rid herself of the whole experience.
Okay.
Because she'd been taking part in the rapes as well and raping these young women. So that's the way I took it.
That's a fair. So she gets out of the shower to see Paul is strangling Caitlin Ross. Later, we learn that Paul claims that Karla killed Caitlin Ross with a mallet. Said he had left to go get food and Caitlin made a break for it and Karla smashed her in the head with a mallet. This is a speculation that is widely believed. I'm just curious why, like, when they found the body, why they couldn't, like, hey, there's a big fucking hole in her head versus, hey, there's ligature marks around her neck.
That's also how I felt, not to like get into the true story side of it too prematurely, but that was part of the real narrative. Was Paul claimed that he left to go get food and he came back and Karla had beaten her with a rubber mallet. And I wonder the same thing, like, wouldn't they notice in an autopsy report, like being strangled versus beaten with a mallet? Yeah, at that one, I was like, I feel like there should be an easy answer to that one.
Right, clearly when you strangle somebody with nylons around the throat, that's why they get broken ribs and stuff like that, right?
Right.
So afterwards, Paul is watching the news and sees that Caitlin's body's been found. The police come by the house to question Paul. Being the suave person that Paul is, he convinces the cops that he is completely innocent. Then there's a scene where Paul is bragging to Karla about how he got the cops to believe in him, and he starts just freestyle rapping about it. It is very, very horrible. And then when Karla doesn't like it and doesn't smile, he beats the shit out of her.
Doesn't he call himself the Scarborough rapist in his rap?
Yeah. He said the Scarborough rapes were just the tip of the caper, but he does call himself the cracker rapper.
Oh my God.
Yeah, it's great. So then Paul starts beating Karla more regular as he starts to spiral out of control. She claims that he is fearful with the cops closing in, which I found was like very contradictory to the fact that he just rapped about being in control of the cops. But let's see. Karla calls Molly to help her. Molly's the friend that was house sitting whenever they went on their honeymoon. Karla calls Molly to help her after an extreme beating. However, Paul convinces her to stay after he threatens to out her involvement in her sister's death, because he still has the videotape, of course. After she chooses to stay, Paul rapes her and strangles her. He stops right before he kills her. He then throws her in the basement and savagely beats her. And again, this gotta be PG-13 because not a lot of this is shown. Like, these beatings are shown, like, from the ground up of, like, Paul just kicking. He could be kicking a sack of dirt, like, none of it, there's no like contact or anything shown on any of these.
Right.
After this beating, friends of Karla's help her escape. The police arrest Paul for spousal abuse because the doctor says it's the worst case of spousal abuse he's seen in all his years. He spends the night in jail. Even though he only spent a night in jail, which did nothing for Karla, it did make them look at his DNA again in relation to the Scarborough rapes. And he matched to 3 suspects, and they put him under surveillance using wiretaps and such. Meanwhile, Paul tries to convince his friends that Karla killed Tammy and that he has the proof on tape, basically saying if she doesn't come back to him that he will use it against her. Karla meets with an attorney, tells him about the murders of Tina McCarthy and Caitlin Ross. At this point, Karla feels liberated from Paul after talking to the attorney. So she goes out to a club and she has sex with Brandon Routh in the bathroom. Brandon Routh from Superman Returns and the Adam and the Arrow TV series. For a second, I thought she was having sex with him, so he would do that thing where he spins the earth backwards and goes back in time before she ever met Paul, but I don't think that's the case. I think this was just before that.
To be clear, he was not Superman in this movie.
Right.
He did not have a cape on.
Right. He hadn't been cast in that role yet. While she's having sex with Superman in the bathroom, Paul is contemplating suicide by stabbing himself in the chest. He obviously can't go through with it, but there's a scene of him sitting against a coffee table, like with a big buck knife, about to stab himself in the chest.
Which I feel like, of all the ways to kill yourself, I'm sorry, but I feel like that's just setting yourself up for a disaster. Like, because I feel like you need so much just like strength and thrust to stab yourself.
Well, and he has a proclivity for like strangling. Why doesn't he just hang himself? I mean, put some nylons around the shower curtain, you know?
Right. Anyway. Oh, because why would you ever do that to a human? How could you do that to yourself? Why would you do that to anyone else?
He didn't see these other people as humans. So anyway, Paul Bernardo gets arrested in a very, very clever scene by the police, I might add. They call and act like they're a, what's it called? Like a
telemarketer?
Yeah, they call and act like they're a telemarketer. And while he's on the phone, they start ringing the doorbell, and he answers the door while on the phone telemarketer, and they just like tackle his ass.
Which I have issue with that because his friends are saying that Paul's leading up to the scene when he's like contemplating suicide. He's basically holed himself up in his house at this point. He's not talking to his friends. His friends are like, oh, he's dodging our calls. He's not seeing us anymore. He decides to answer the phone for a telemarketer. Like, he dodges all these phone calls, and the one that he answers.
Right. Yeah, totally.
Although I agree. I thought it was very clever.
Like, I mean, he is, of course, drinking, and it's like clearly like 8 a.m. So, I mean, you know, maybe he was like, oh, it's Karla. Let me answer the phone. Anyway,
about that.
So Paul Bernardo gets arrested. Karla learns about it while watching the news at some random one-night stand's apartment.
No, that was Superman's apartment.
No, it wasn't.
Yes, it was.
Superman had a really dark tan then, if that was still Superman's apartment.
I'm pretty sure she went home with Superman that night.
Anyway, in court, Paul claimed Karla murdered Caitlin. He admits to doing wrong, but says he never killed those girls. Paul is convicted on 2 counts of murder, sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Karla accepts a plea bargain for her roles in the murders and in the giving of information and was given only 12 years. So in the end, Karla was denied parole by Dr. Arnold. We then go to the black screens where they put up the facts and what happened after the story. And this is supposedly taken from the actual parole denial paperwork. It says Karla Homolka is a person highly artificial, articulate, manipulative, who is egocentric, if not narcissistic, and whose behavior cannot be explained solely on the basis of intimidation or abuse by Paul Bernardo. So basically saying this is not all his fault. The report went on to note that despite her ability to present herself well, there is a moral vacuity and absence of empathy for her victims, which suggests tendencies towards psychosis. Nice. And again, like I said, she was denied parole. On July 4th, 2005, after serving her full 12-year term, she was released. Citing her absence of remorse or insight, the court determined her to be a continuing threat to society and imposed various restrictions on her freedom. It's also noted that the families of the teenage victims of her crimes noted in October 2005 that as of that time, Karla Homolka had not apologized to them or communicated remorse or regret in any way. Mm-hmm. And that wraps up the movie.
I feel like I was frowning the whole time I was watching this movie.
Yeah, I watched it, 2 times just to make sure I got all the notes and caught everything. And yeah, the second time I watched it, I was just like, wow, this movie really bums me out.
Yeah, very unsavory and just even more upsetting knowing that it was a true story. So, segue into the true story. So right now I'm going to talk about the research I did on what really happened. Then we'll compare our notes. I'm going to kind of start where the movie started in Karla's telling of the story, and that is with her and Paul meeting. Paul and Karla met in 1987 when Karla was 17 years old and Paul was 23. They did meet at a hotel restaurant in Scarborough, Toronto, where Karla was attending a pet food convention because she was working at a pet store at this time. When they met, Karla was with a friend in the restaurant, and they said that there was immediate electricity between them. At this time, Paul was attending college at the University of Toronto nearby. It was during this time, unbeknownst to Karla, but Paul was already committing the series of brutal assaults that came to be known as crimes done by the Scarborough rapist. So at the hotel, there was immediate electricity between the two of them. Within a few hours, they were having sex with each other. I didn't find any information on whether or not they made their friends watch while they had sex, but yeah, it said that they had sex that night. And by Christmas Eve of 1989, Paul and Karla were engaged.
So they were engaged at that point, because there's a scene in the movie that I didn't touch on where Paul is being interviewed by the police in the first suspect, like when he was first suspected for the Scarborough rapes, when the sketch has gone out and all of his friends are saying. And in that interview, he says that he's engaged to a girl that lives up in wherever the hell they live.
Yeah, so... Okay, so the Scarborough rapes were happening between roughly May of 1987, and I believe they met in October of 87. And the last rape that's attributed to the Scarborough rapist happened in about the summer of 1990.
Wow, okay.
And on Christmas Eve of 1989, they were engaged. In 1990, Paul loses his job at the accounting firm because he went to school to become an accountant. But he later turned to cigarette smuggling to make money, as you mentioned. I wasn't able to find anything in my research exactly if he moved in with the Homolkas ever. I did see that he didn't tell them about losing his job at the accounting firm. So I take it that he didn't move in with them because he didn't want them to know that he had lost his job. So I'm going to say that I don't think that happened in real life.
That's a very interesting fact for them to throw into the movies without it actual happening, especially since it didn't provide anything to the story. You know, there wasn't ever a scene of like Paul and the family together in the same room or anything like that, you know?
But the Homolka family did really like Paul. They kind of took him in, and, you know, Tammy looked up to him as an older brother. So maybe that was just the movie's way of... God, I know, it's so fucked up. But maybe that was just the movie's shorthand way of saying, you know, this family really grew to like Paul and took him in. Without them, I don't think they actually...
Gotcha. It was
took him into their house. Yeah, so about mid-1990, the summer of 1990, is when Paul begins to show an interest in Karla's 15-year-old sister, Tammy.
So at this point now, Karla is actually 18, because they met when she was 17, so this is, you said, a year...
Yeah, so she's probably closer to like 20.
Okay.
1920.
Gotcha.
It's 1990. And
I can't math.
That's
so.
okay. That's what I'm here for. And just like you said, since Parla,
Parla. That's their celebrity name, Parla.
When I was making notes, I kept writing Paula. Because it's Paul and Karla.
Nice.
So I'm probably going to call her Paula a lot.
It's okay.
Karla, since she couldn't give her virginity to Paul, she decides that the next best thing is to give her sister's virginity to her fiance. So I thought this was interesting. It wasn't mentioned in the movie, but Paul said it in his testimony that in July of 1990 that he and Karla served Tammy a spaghetti dinner that is laced with Valium to get her to pass out. And Paul begins raping Tammy for, quote, about a minute, which, based on the movie, you think he'd be done.
That's pretty accurate, yeah.
No, but it says that he raped her for about a minute before she began to wake up, and they just kind of stopped. So now, November 1990 is when the composite sketch of the Scarborough rapist is released, and a lot of people notice that it bears a striking resemblance to Paul, and more than one of his friends call into the police tip line saying, hey, you need to check out Paul Bernardo as a suspect in the Scarborough rapes. So at that point, Paul is brought in for questioning by the police, and he has a DNA sample taken, and he's released. His DNA sample is put into storage where it won't be tested for at least 2 years. So looking back on it, a lot of people have a lot of problems with that. Just the fact that the police literally didn't look at his sample for 2 years and just let him go.
Why even take a sample if you're not going to go through the process of testing it?
But I mean, things were different. It was 1990. DNA was a little...
Like the advances that we have today.
Exactly. The technology was a little different, but still, it's a lot of murders could have, at least the murders of these two young girls could have been avoided if it was acted upon.
Right, because when he was the Scarborough rapist, he was just raping people, not to make that sound any less of a tragedy.
No, but he wasn't killing.
But he wasn't killing, yeah. Okay.
He was letting them go.
Which is
So
just crazy. Yeah.
That's an interesting point I'll bring up later.
Right.
Okay. So, November 1990, Paul's released and probably getting pretty cocky that he was questioned by the police for the Scarborough rapes, which he did, and then released. But here comes Christmas Eve, 1990. While the rest of the household is asleep, Paul and Karla give Tammy cocktails laced with sleeping pills. Like you said, what is it?
Halcyon?
Halcyon.
Which is... it's benzodiazepine, which is Xanax and Valium are both also benzodiazepines.
So they give her the cocktails with the sleeping pills, knocks her out, and once she's passed out, Karla uses halothane, which she stole from the veterinary clinic where she's now working, to keep Tammy from waking up, basically. Paul rapes Tammy, and when he's done, he orders Karla to molest her as well, and she does. And at this point, Tammy begins to vomit and choke on her vomit. The events from the night are videotaped on Paul's camera, as you noted. And apparently, so looking back on it, halothane should not be used if the patient, which is usually animals, has eaten food or had liquids within the past 24 hours, which clearly she had.
Which, yeah, they were drugging her with alcohol and...
Right, and I'm sure she ate
whatever.
ate in the last 24 hours.
Yes.
So it's also, halothane is also intended to be used in a vaporizer instead of doused in a rag, which is what Karla did, and they showed her doing that in the movie. So she held the rag to her sister's face while Paul was raping her, and this led to a bright red rash on the side of Tammy's face. When the police questioned Paul and Karla about the rash, they said it was rug burn from them attempting to revive her.
Right, because when you do CPR, you always shove somebody's face right into the rug, right? Yeah. I mean, that's what I always do.
And it doesn't... So, disclaimer, the pictures are... You can find the picture of, like, Tammy's face with the rash on it, and it's clearly not a rug burn.
No, it looks like a shark decided to bite part of her face off. It's not pretty by any means.
No, it's really fucked up. So what really upset me about this was that the police took Paul and Karla's story as the truth. They assumed that it was just like another tragic story of a teenager, a young 15-year-old girl mixing drugs and alcohol, and she died from an overdose. So Tammy's death was never investigated despite this weird rash on her face, and obviously that means Paul and Karla were never investigated for her death. So in February of 1991, Paul and Karla move into a rental house in St. Catharines. In June of that year, 14-year-old Leslie Mahaffey is abducted, raped, and killed. So in the movie, her name is...
Tina McCarthy.
Tina McCarthy, yeah. In June of 1991, Homolka and Bernardo get married. On the same day that they're married, the body of Leslie Mahaffey is discovered dismembered and set in blocks of concrete. Her body was discovered by fishermen in a lake near St. Catharines.
Does it say whether they knew? Because they were getting married that day.
Yes.
Right. Did they find out that day, or did they find out when they got back from their honeymoon?
So I didn't find any details on their honeymoon and if they actually honeymooned in Hawaii or exactly when they found out. But I do believe that it kind of scared Paul and Karla because they didn't do their next abduction until almost a full year later.
Wow.
So in April of 1992, 15-year-old Kristen French is abducted by Karla and Paul from a church parking lot. 2 weeks later, the body of Kristen French is found naked in a ditch with her hair cut off.
Something they didn't do in the movie.
Right. Karla.
This was Caitlin Ross's.
That's right. Yes, in
Which
the movie.
I find it interesting that they changed the name, because usually they do that to protect like living people.
Right.
But
I agree.
I feel like this is such a like closely related story that it's super easy to just find out like, oh, okay, this is this person's real name.
And I think I agree because it was widely publicized. Their names were either well known or you could easily find them out from the stories. So I agree. I was very surprised that they changed the names, but I guess I can do whatever they want to do in the movie.
Yeah, I'm not sure if you saw, but there was the lawyer for the families actually requested a pre-screening of the movie to see if they were going to fight the release of it. Mm-hmm. And they decided not to, so which even makes me more wonder why they changed the names, you know?
Interesting. So it wasn't even that the family's lawyer had requested that they change their names.
No.
Curious.
Not that I saw, anyway.
Okay. So when they were abducting Kristen French, a lot of people saw Paul and Karla taking her. Multiple witnesses reported seeing 2 people, so now the police knew that they were looking for 2 suspects and not just one. Also, multiple people came forward and reported that the 2 kidnappers were driving a beige Camaro. So this is a fact that the police really ran with. They created a poster board with a picture of a beige Camaro saying, call the tip line if you see this car. It's related to the Kristen French abduction. And the police were just really running with this detail. And unfortunately, Paul actually drove a gold Nissan. So this incorrect detail really kind of threw off the police and prolonged their search for the 2 criminals.
That's what I was going to ask about, because there's a scene in the movie where he mockingly laughs at the TV and says stupid cops can't even tell the difference between a Camaro and a Nissan. So.
Oh, I didn't even catch that in the movie.
Yeah.
Well, there you go. That's what it's from. Real life.
All right.
Crazy. So in December of 1992, Karla goes to the ER after being violently beaten by Paul. And just like in the movie, the ER doctor said that in his 15 years, that was the worst case of domestic abuse that he had ever seen.
Did you see the pictures from it?
Yeah, it's really messed up. So she has this condition. They call it raccoon eyes. There's also another name for it, something coop. But basically the way it's caused is from the brain hitting the front of the skull so hard, it causes this discoloration in the eyes. So
it honestly does look like she just went crazy with some black paint around her eyes.
I thought she just had 2 black eyes, because in the movie they show her eyes like really badly. Yeah. I thought it was just black eyes, but when I read what it actually was, I was like, oh my God, that's so much more messed up.
Yeah.
So I thought it was interesting that you brought up that after this really bad case of domestic abuse, that Paul was put in prison for a night, and that led to them
relooking at his DNA.
Yes. I am not sure if that ever happened. Obviously, as I mentioned before, it took them 2 years to look at the DNA samples, but I don't know, well, 1, why it took 2 years, or 2, if there was a reason that triggered them to look at his DNA samples again. But in February of 1993, Paul's DNA samples that were collected in the Scarborough rape crimes were finally tested, confirming Paul was involved in the rapes. So Paul is arrested for being the Scarborough rapist. And once he's arrested, Karla is brought in for questioning. And she goes in understanding that she's being questioned about the Scarborough rapes. But the questions that they're asking and or the way that they're asking the questions kind of tips Karla off into believing that the police are making a connection of Paul, the Scarborough rapist, to the deaths of Leslie Mahaffey and Kristen French. This alerts Karla, and she gets a lawyer so she can start. Basically, she's starting her defense before they even consider her to be a suspect, really.
This is where the manipulation starts.
Right. This is...
Or the claims of manipulation.
Right. This is another point that's kind of the police are kind of criticized for in how they handled the questioning, because the questions they were asking and the way they were asking them really tipped Karla off and allowed her all this extra time to prepare that she shouldn't have had.
Gotcha.
So basically, she gets a lawyer and claims to be an unwilling participant in the crimes and a victim of beaten spouse syndrome. So basically, she was going along with it in fear for her life. And of course, her lawyer and the courts believed her, and they began working on a plea bargain. The biggest thing that she had on her side was she was going to the authorities and saying, hey, Paul committed these murders of Leslie Mahaffey and Kristen French. And really, the police had no other evidence linking him to these crimes other than Karla's word. So they really needed her to testify against him. So I think that was really in her favor when she was working on this plea bargain.
So did you find any evidence of them actually putting him under surveillance? Any that was released anyway?
Not anything that was released, no.
Okay.
So after Karla gets a lawyer and everything, now a search warrant is obtained for their home in St. Catharines. And there's a 71-day search where the police failed to find the videotapes, which were in the attic containing the rapes.
Wow. 71 days search.
71 days. And so you have to put yourself in the mindset of the courts at this point. They don't see what a role Karla has in these crimes. They just see this as a beaten spouse, a beaten wife, and the only reason she's not going to the police is for fear of her life.
Right. But at some point she had come forward with information, right?
Right. Yes. In May of 1993, Karla's plea deal is finalized. And it wasn't until Paul's trial that the videotapes containing the actual rapes that people realized how involved Karla was in these crimes.
But at this point, her plea deal had already gone through.
Exactly. And they weren't going to go back and evaluate it. So in June of 1993, Karla's trial begins. She pleads guilty to the 2 counts of manslaughter and receives 2 12-year jail sentences to be served out consecutively. That means at the same time, right? Like, so even though there were 2...
No, consecutively means one after the other.
Because can't they serve them at the same time? What is that called?
They can. It's called concurrently.
Concurrently, not consecutively. I meant to say concurrently. Another interesting fact about Karla's trial is that it had a publication ban on it, which was very unusual. But basically this only allowed journalists were allowed to come to her trial, but they could only report on the charges and the sentence itself. And they did this so that Paul could have a fair trial. This also led to more public outrage over how secretive her sentencing was, or her trial was. So it wasn't until September of 1994 that the videotapes containing the footage of Paul and Karla raping their victims surfaced, and this revealed that Karla played a bigger role in the crimes than she let on. Paul's trial officially began in May of 1995. He was convicted of the murders of Leslie Mahaffey and Kristen French, receiving life in prison and a dangerous offender designation, which basically means that the convicted person is subject to longer or indefinite detention in order to protect the public. This is the full maximum sentence allowed in Canada. So, as you kind of hinted to before, Paul has admitted to every sexual assault charged to him, but he still insists that Karla was the one who actually committed the murders.
Which, I mean, if we look at the fact that he was a Scarborough rapist and never killed anybody, and then all of a sudden with these victims dealing with Karla, all of a sudden there's murder involved. I mean, it's like, what is the variable here?
Yeah, so that was something I wanted to talk about, was after the trial and everything, people referred to Karla's plea bargain as the deal with the devil. So, I mean, yes, you bring up a good point. So when Paul was committing the Scarborough rapes, all of his victims were allowed to live. And it wasn't until he started committing the crimes with Karla that his victims were actually killed.
Right.
And there's also evidence that apparently Paul had intended on allowing the victims, meaning Leslie Mahaffey and Kristen French, to live. He claims that he went out to get food in a movie one night, and even went to fill his car up with gas so that the following day he could drop the girl off at home without getting stranded with a missing girl in his car. Because he was like, well, it'd look really bad if I got stranded out in the middle of wherever and I had a missing girl in my car. And I was like, guess how we all avoid doing that? It's not by filling up our cars. It's by not kidnapping people. So he claimed that he went out to get food, rented a movie, filled his car up with gas, and when he came home, Karla had killed the girl. I believe he claimed that with both Leslie Mahaffey and Kristen French, he did that. And since Paul went to school to become an accountant, he actually had the receipts to show that he went and got food, got the movie, and filled up his car with gas. So, I mean, I guess we don't officially know like what time these girls died, so we don't know if he was doing that to, I guess, give himself an alibi. But if he did, it was like, I don't know. It was kind of interesting. So he claims he had totally intended to let the girls live and was ready to take them back, but Karla had already killed them. Also, like a former coworker and friend of Karla's, after all this had come out, stated that she believed that Karla's actions were those of a psychopath and not an abused spouse. And like you said, it was true. The lawyers of the families have stated that Karla has yet to apologize. I just think it's really interesting. We'll probably never really know like who actually committed the murder, since Karla claims that Paul did and Paul holds that Karla committed them. So right. It's crazy and it's messed up. So kind of going back to true events. So you said at the start of the movie, they said it was taking place in October of 2000, correct?
Yes.
So in October of 2000, Karla was transferred to a maximum security prison for a psychiatric evaluation. So I don't know if that's what they were portraying in the movie or if it was just a vehicle for the story to be told. I think they were just looking for a good excuse to say this is why Karla's telling her side of the story.
Right, which that's kind of why I worded it that way at the beginning, was because I feel like that's all it was just a vehicle for, and so everybody also understood, like, hey, this is her telling her side. This isn't
like what really happened, because like
right, despite the fact that the claims or this is based on court transcriptions, interviews, and videos shot by the both of them. It does seem very much from Karla's perspective.
Yeah, the movie weighs very heavily on, obviously it shows Paul committing the stranglings. It shows Paul beating Karla, and Karla feeling the need that she has to continue.
Right, he's very much the aggressor, the dominant, and she's very much the submissive and the just trying to please her man.
Right, and it sounds like in real life that might not have been her.
It may have been more well balanced, or
so Karla was evaluated multiple times by psychiatrists. Obviously, before she went into prison, she was evaluated. And one of the psychiatrists, I thought this was interesting. I pulled this quote out because I think all or part of this quote was used at the end of the movie, like you stated. But this is a quote from one of the psychiatrists saying, Homolka remains something of a diagnostic mystery. Despite her ability to present herself very well, there is a moral vacuity in her which is difficult, if not impossible, to explain. So just hinting at that lack of remorse.
Right.
Feeling bad for what she did. In December of 2004, the National Parole Board rules that Karla must serve her full prison term, again, which was only 12 years. In 2005, Homolka was released from prison after serving her full 12-year sentence. But like you said, it was with a lot of
restrictions on her
yes,
life.
Thank you. And she now goes by the name Leanne Teal, and she is now remarried and with 3 children. So one thing that really upset me about this case was the fact that nobody ever got charged with Tammy's murder.
Even though it's the most well-known murder in the situation. Like, in the whole story of the 3 murders, it is the most well-known, and nobody was charged in it.
Yeah, nobody was charged. It was never investigated. It's just really upsetting to me.
It is. It's wild. So if we now look at, the comparisons between the two, I think it's safe to say that there is a lot of facts.
Surprisingly accurate.
Yeah.
I would agree.
I mean, with I feel the exception of this is from Karla's point of view, and I feel her roles in all of this may have been downplayed a lot.
In the movie, yeah.
The facts of what happened as far as like dismemberment, disposal of bodies, the killings, the time frames, even because I mean, they got married and then like in Easter the next year is when they decided to abduct the third girl. Like I feel all of that stuff is in the movie. I think the only notes I took that were like different were the fact that she worked at a pet store, not a veterinary clinic.
I mean, eventually she did work for a veterinary clinic, but yeah, in the movie, she was working at a veterinary clinic when she was at the convention that she met Paul
She was at a pet store.
Yeah, she was, in real life, she was working for a pet store.
Right. And she was 17, not 18 when they met.
Yeah. Which meant she was still in high school when they met.
And then also the fact that the names were changed. The third girl, whose real name was not Caitlin Ross, but
Kristen French.
Kristen French, had her hair cut.
Yes.
That wasn't covered in the movie.
Karla claimed that they cut her hair because they thought...
This is also the same one that she supposedly murdered with a mallet.
Right. And again, that was believed. I don't know if her body sustained injuries that were consistent with being beaten with rubber mallets and a strangling. I don't know.
Right. I mean, to me, it makes, I don't know, I guess whenever I think I think of, somebody getting struck across the head with a rubber mallet.
It's very clear.
But if they cut her hair, that would make that even more noticeable.
So Karla claimed that they cut her hair because they thought it would be harder to identify her body. Some people believe they took it as a souvenir.
So they dismember the first, or the middle one, and then they cut the second one's hair. Like they've already identified the woman that you dismembered and put into concrete blocks, and they're not going to be able to tell if you just cut her hair.
Right. And it's actually interesting. So I don't know if this is the only reason why they were able to identify the body, but what led to the identification of Leslie Mahaffey was her, they called it orthodontist appliance. I don't know if that's the right word. But
like a retainer?
Yeah, she had braces. And so that's how they were able to identify her, I guess, was by her orthodontics.
Interesting.
Yeah, which was interesting.
So all in all, I would say this movie is for the most part factual. However, the actual happenings in the story may be up for questioning.
Yes.
As for what happened, it's true, but as for who did it is the question, I guess.
Yes.
It's a true whodunit.
It really is, because we don't know. I don't know if we'll ever know.
Right, and we probably won't. I mean, you're talking about two people who are psychopaths. They have charm and wit and just want to manipulate people and probably lie just because they can get away with it.
Mm-hmm. Oh, I did kind of mention it. Never mind. They did find the videotapes. The videotapes were viewed in court.
And then destroyed, right?
Yes. So people were allowed to come to Paul Bernardo's trial where they played the videotapes. They only allowed, I believe, Paul and like maybe the judge to see the actual video, but people could hear the audio. And once the videotapes were no longer needed for legal purposes, they were destroyed.
Which is crazy. I mean, you would think that they...
I mean, I don't know if they'll ever need to like open the case up again because...
But I'm saying like in America, like people have the right to, what's it called?
Appeal.
Appeal. Okay, so...
And
you know, do they ever need it for like appellate court? You know, now I feel like if they are trying to do appeals, like they've got no proof.
I mean, Paul did appeal, I believe, but I think his request was denied.
Okay.
Both Paul and Karla were in jail at one point for these murders. I don't think there was any question of whether or not someone else should have been convicted.
Gotcha.
But I mean, that is kind of crazy that they were destroyed, but also like understandably so.
Right.
Do you want to hear the story of the videotapes? The true story of what happened to the videotapes?
Yeah.
So the police searched the house for 71 days, didn't find the videotapes in the attic. Paul Bernardo's lawyer was given access to the house after the police searched it, and he found the videotapes, and he viewed them and held on to them because he wanted to present them in court against Karla, but she never went to a full trial because she took the plea bargain.
Gotcha.
So he was just holding on to these tapes and holding on to these tapes. And he's like, I think I fucked up holding on to these tapes.
Oh, shit.
And so he went to the, Canada. I don't know if it's called a bar association, but basically their board. And he said, so I've got these tapes of young children being raped in this case that I'm working. What should I do? And they basically told him, you have to turn them over, give them to the authorities, and you'll have to quit as Paul's defense attorney. And so he did. And the new lawyer that took over, he held on to them for a couple of days and then decided, okay, yeah, we need to use these in trial. And so then that's when they surfaced. So that's another thing that's kind of like messed up. Like if that guy hadn't held on to the tapes for so long, maybe they could have been used against Karla and she wouldn't have gotten her plea bargain. But this poor guy who had the videotapes, he was convicted of what is it called when he like withheld evidence,
right? Like
or something, impeding justice.
Yeah,
it was something like that. Yes, yeah. Impeding an investigation and for having possession of child pornography. This poor guy, he was planning on bringing it up in Karla's trial, and then it never happened. And then he just like, oh shit, what do I do with this? So they're like, you are a pedophile.
Oh, that's fucked up.
Yeah. I think he was acquitted of the charges, but it was just like, this poor guy, he's already had to quit like his job in this high profile case, and he was like, oh, this will be the perfect, I gotcha. And then it never happened. He's like, no, I've just got these videotapes. That's what really happened with the videotapes.
I wanted to throw some interesting facts in about stuff that's happened, I guess, since the release.
Of the movie?
Right.
Yeah.
One was about the movie being shot. Like I said, it was released in Canada a year before it was released in the States, even though the entire thing was shot in the United States with a completely American crew. It was shot in Los Angeles because nobody in the Canadian film industry wanted to touch the thing.
Oh, fair enough.
And since the release, Misha Collins, who plays Paul Bernardo, has stated that he regrets even participating in it.
Really?
He said that he was unaware of the infamy and the strong emotions in Canada surrounding the crimes.
Like, I think it's like a really big deal in Canada. Like, I think people are really upset about it. I mean, rightfully so, but like, I would never bring it up to a person in Canada.
Well, he says after a telephone conversation with a victim who managed to escape, so I guess one of the like Scarborough rape victims, he now routinely tells people not to watch the film.
Really?
Yeah, he says like when people come up to him at supernatural conventions and it gets mentioned, he tells them not to watch it. And like people will walk up and ask him to sign the DVD, and he's like, you should not watch this.
Interesting.
On a lighter note, that's a pun as well, because we're talking about Laura Prepon and her blonde hair that she dyed for the film.
I was wondering.
Yeah.
Oh, is there a connection between why she went blonde on that 70s show?
Yes. But she dyed her hair blonde for this movie, and as a result, her character on that 70s show had blonde hair for the last 2 seasons.
That's funny that you mention it, because while we were watching the movie, I literally had to look up the year the movie was released and how it overlapped with that 70s show, and I was like, I wonder if that's why she went blonde on that 70s show. Yeah.
You also mentioned that Karla's name now, her last name is Teal.
Yes.
Teale. Paul Bernardo's last name is now Teal also.
I feel like that's so weird because now she's married to someone else.
Right, but they apparently changed their names before going to prison. Paul claims that it's after a Kevin Bacon character in the movie Criminal Law, which came out in 1988, where Kevin Bacon plays a serial killer, and his last name is Thiel, Thiel.
Okay.
But apparently he relates to him or idolizes the character, and therefore they changed their names
to a serial killer, to pay homage to a serial killer.
Yeah.
Kind of feel like that's a
right
red light.
It's like clearly,
look at me.
Right. And the fact that they both changed their name, clearly, who's getting manipulated here? You know, if Karla was truly free of Paul and they both now changed their name.
How do we know it wasn't Paula who said, let's change our names?
Paula? Because Paula doesn't exist in this film.
To Karla. God. For the rest of my life.
Well, next movie we'll watch, we'll make sure that there aren't similar names.
They're not even...
But anyway, that is our conversation about Karla, the true story of Karla Homolka and her boyfriend Paul Bernardo, husband. Yeah, I think that it's a pretty factual movie. Like I said, it's definitely a true whodunit because the facts are there, but who carried it out is what is really at question.
We'll never know. I totally agree. It was a really good representation, I feel like, aside from Paul doing the killings. But there was so I watched a documentary about Paul and Karla, and they showed a clip of, I think it was a clip of the Christmas Eve tape of Tammy drinking. I guess I don't know if that's really what I saw because the tapes were destroyed, or was this clip taken before the tapes were destroyed? But literally, I thought I was looking at a clip from the movie we had just watched, because like the way that the clip was filmed in real life was very similar to how it was filmed in the movie. And I was like, wow, they like got even that spot on. So I think they did their research. And I mean, unfortunately, I think it was really easy to do research for this movie because there's so much on it. And just the fact that they recorded everything they did.
Right, it was so well publicized.
Yeah, I mean, just the videotapes, though, of the crimes that they did. Like, there's just so much evidence out there. There's just so much out there on this case that it was all right there.
Well, cool. So that wraps up this week. Next week, we will be bringing you Winchester.
Ooh.
We're going to do a supernatural story based on a true story. And remember, if you want to find us, you can find us on Instagram at Drink to Fact, or you can find us on Twitter at Drink to Fact, or you can look us up on Facebook. And we'll see you next week, guys.
Yeah, I'm excited. Thanks, guys.